Invited guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the third day of the update 2019, and I'm excited to see many of us are floating in, and I hope that the room will be much more crowded in the next 10 minutes or so. So if you're seated right at the top, please, we invite you to come closer to us. Today we're going to be talking about labor mobility, so I want you to move closer to us as soon as you can. That will help a bit. I'm Roop, and I'm currently the acting head of School of Economics here at the university, and it's my pleasure to chair this session this morning. As you know, there's lots of things going on campus right now, so my apologies. Many of our staff from the school are not being able to be part of this, but I'm getting a good crowd of us to join you, and we hope to join you further as we get more time. Let me introduce the panel today for this morning's session. And on my left, we have Professor Stephen Howes, and he's the Director of Development Policy Center of the ANU. Following him, we have Jane Bustin, and she's the Director of Pacific Labor Mobility and Skills Program section of the Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia. Professor John Connell, well-known professor, University of Sydney. We pleasure to get him on board, and there's a joint presentation by him and Christy. She's a research associate with University of Adelaide. So with that, I do not want to waste any more time. I invite Professor Stephen Howes for his deliberations, please.
Thank you. Did I go over there?
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this third day of the Pacific Update Conference and the what we're calling our Labour Mobility Research Workshop. I'll just give you a bit of a background to why we're holding this workshop on the third day. This is actually our third Labour Mobility Research Workshop that we've held over the years. The first was back in 2011, a long time ago. Some of you were there. And the second, that was in Canberra. The second also was in ANU in 2017. And this is the third. And the fact that they're happening with more frequency indicates, is indicative of the growing interest in the subject, both on the part of academics and on the part of DFAT. And it was in discussions with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade that we thought the Pacific Update could be a good venue for bringing people together with a common interest in labour mobility. And we had so many submissions for the main update that we decided to separate it out and add it on as a third day. So that's how we got here, and thanks to everyone who's come along. I do want to say it is a workshop, as against a conference, so it is meant to be very interactive. And so I do encourage those of you who've taken the seats in the back row to move down to the front. And definitely for the next session after morning tea, we're going to enforce that. We're going to be putting a lot of pressure on you to move down to the front row so we can have more of a discussion. This is a very, very big lecture theatre, and we want to make it more like a seminar. So if you're not going to cooperate now, then we'll make you, we'll put people in place to make you cooperate after morning tea. So we are very interested in your views. Some of you will have been to this thing called the PLAM, which is now there's an annual meeting on Pacific labour mobility. I mean, that's somewhat different, or very different to this, right? That's with employers and governments, as well as a few researchers. This is meant to be research focused, but of course we are very happy and fortunate to have some government representatives that you'll be hearing from, both the sending country and the receiving country side. But the main focus is on research, and not only in research findings, but in finding out what research is going on. So I encourage you all to contribute, and although we don't want long speeches, you don't have to ask a question. We are interested in learning about your research, especially if it's underway, it hasn't been published yet. Do let us know, do make contact with us, and let's make sure we exchange emails and try and develop a bit of a community around labour mobility research. Just to finish off with the structure of today, we're starting out with the literature survey that's been done by John Connell and Kirsty Petro. So that's their take on what is out there and then what the gaps are. So we thought that's a really good way to start. Then the second session, we're looking at the issue of sending country governance. So now that the seasonal labour schemes have taken off, what are the issues that are arising on the sending country side, and what's emerging as best practice? So I'm afraid you'll be hearing from me again. That's sort of been one of our main focus areas over the last year. And then after lunch, we're breaking up into two groups, and we'll have one group on the issue of skills and labour mobility, and issues around brain drain and around the role of the APTC. And the other group is around social impacts. So some of the issues that came up yesterday around family separation, reintegration, those sorts of things. And then we'll come back for the final session, which is a brainstorming session, where there won't be any papers. There'll be some short presentations at the start, both from the sending country side and from some of the researchers, the World Bank, whom we're working with, and also the PLF, which is the Pacific Labour Facility that DFAT's funding, that also has a research role. And that's meant to be the most interactive session, where we really want to get your ideas on what should be the research agenda going forward. So I think it should be a really good day, and I just want to again thank you all for coming, and I hope you all enjoy it.
Thank you, Professor Stephen. Now we have Jane.
Hula, malawalele, talofa, bufala morning orketa, kia ora. Hello and good morning. I acknowledge all the distinguished guests here today from across government. Can you hear me? From across government, academia, civil society and the private sector. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it really is an honour and a privilege to be giving the opening address to today's Labour Mobility workshop. I'm humbled by the expertise and knowledge in the room. There are so many people here today who have extensive experience and many years and years of work in labour mobility across the region and from the Pacific. So it's wonderful that we're here today to have this workshop and have a discussion around labour mobility from the Pacific. As Stephen said, many of us working in labour mobility have been talking for some time in the last 12 months about the importance, given the timing and importance of labour mobility, of coming together for a discussion. And I'm so pleased that the workshop is happening in the Pacific, here together with the Pacific Update. And it's great that it's attracted so much participation from across the region. Quickly, a little bit about me and my perspective. So I work at the Office of the Pacific that John Feeks, the Australian High Commissioner, mentioned in his address. So I work for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but at the moment in the Office of the Pacific, we're more than the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So we've got a whole range of people from across the Australian government who've come together to form the office. So I sit along colleagues from across the Australian government. Our head of the Office of the Pacific is Ewan McDonald, and Ewan is prioritising close engagement with his counterparts in the region, and I know he's recently visited here in Fiji. Within the Office of the Pacific, my team and I work to deliver Australia's labour mobility, skills and education programs. And we work really closely with our network of posts and high commissions, embassies across the Pacific to work in partnership with our Pacific partners in a bilateral sense, but also with regional organisations. I'll keep coming back to our partnership because it is really important and it's a critical component of the way that both Australia and New Zealand approaches labour mobility. So this morning in my address, I'm going to talk about my reflections on where we're at 12 months into Australia's new arrangements in labour mobility and how we're progressing. I'll do this by reflecting on Australia's perspective, but I'd also like to reflect on what I'm hearing from Pacific partners and regional partners, some of the things that I've heard today in the forum, with the caveat that I'm really looking forward to hearing more today, given that we're going to have the substantive conversation about labour mobility. I'm not going to go into the detail of what the programs are. I think Stephen did this yesterday and John and Kirsty will do that in their presentation this morning. And for those of you who are data hungry, I'm not going to go into detail about data in my presentation. And I am going to kind of switch between perspectives, so I'm not going to give you a clear sense of Australia's perspective and then Pacific. I'm going to switch between the two. So 12 months into Australia's new labour mobility arrangements, how are we progressing? To start with the Australian perspective, it is important to say that our foreign policy white paper has the step up in the Pacific as one of the highest priorities. And I think it's also worth noting that the white paper sets out a 10-year vision. It's not an annual plan, it is a long-term vision for our engagement with the Pacific. And labour mobility is relevant because it's part of a broader objective that is about regional economic prosperity and integration. New opportunities for Pacific citizens to access employment in Australia is a practical step towards economic prosperity and integration. But it isn't just about economic integration. The Foreign Policy White Paper also prioritises relationships between people, or as we sometimes talk about, people-to-people links. At the centre, or at the heart of Pacific labour mobility to Australia are Pacific citizens and Australian employers. At this point, I'd like to quote Kalmal Sepa from Vanuatu, who recently wrote a dev policy blog called Through the Lens of a Seasonal Worker. I note that he was actually a participant of the RSE, the New Zealand scheme, but his sentiments apply to both or either Australia and New Zealand schemes. I commend the blog to you. It's a really great personal account that breathes life into the issues of education, skills and labour mobility. As development practitioners and as policy and program officers, we know that these issues require a systems approach and they require government regulation and policy. But we also know from our individual experience that they're issues that fundamentally have an impact on individuals and families. At the very end of the blog, he says, "For me, the RSE scheme is about new opportunities, using new skills to create new dreams." The message for me in this is that Australia needs to nurture the pathways that offer labour mobility opportunities, and that gaining new skills is the aspiration and outcome for many participants. New skills to create new dreams. In this statement, he doesn't talk about income, he doesn't talk about employment, but it's about opportunities, skills, and dreams. One of the things that I've heard here and also gleaned from the Pacific Skills Summit that was held here at USP last week is that Pacific countries do want to manage labour mobility opportunities so that the benefits are shared and that there is equitable access. We need to reconcile this with the needs of Australian employers, who are the ultimate decision makers in who they recruit and who they employ. But I don't think the two things are necessarily mutually exclusive. I think this shows the importance of the Australian partnership with Pacific governments to ensure the integrity of our programs so that Australian employers continue to participate in the program and that the programs grow, but that we also look for opportunities to meet the needs of Pacific countries. Skills development is important for both the Pacific and for Australian employers. Skills development is bigger than labour mobility alone. And with my education hat on, I have to say that it starts with basic literacy and numeracy, then leading on to vocational and tertiary skills for employment, but also for life. So I think we've got the skills session later today that we'll go into more detail about that. So back to the question of how we're progressing. Over the past 12 months, we've signed bilateral MOUs with 10 countries to participate in the new Pacific Labour Scheme. So it's the same set of countries who are participating in the seasonal worker program. So that is Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga, Tuvalu and Vanuatu. I mentioned partnership earlier, and it is through a bilateral government-to-government MOU that enables Pacific citizens to come to Australia to work. So action is required from both partners to enable the programs to operate. A critical action for the Australian government is working closely with Australian employers who need to become approved employers in order for themselves to participate in the schemes. So together with workers, approved employers have responsibilities and obligations under the schemes. Quickly on statistics, we now have over 200 participants in the Pacific Labour Scheme currently employed in Australia, and we have about 50 approved employers. It was 50, I think, last week. I'm not sure if it's gone up. And this is alongside continued and upwards growth in the seasonal worker program, which has now granted over 37,000 visas since 2012. The Pacific Labour Scheme was uncapped in November 2018, which should give a strong message to industry, to Australian employers, that their demand will drive the growth of the scheme. On the numbers, I would like to note that given the number of approved employers, I expect the numbers of employers will rise quickly, even without additional approved employers. So there is a lag between an approved employer becoming registered in the scheme and then workers arriving in Australia. So I think that number of 50 and the number of 200 doesn't quite match because we've got a number of new approved employers and the participants who they will have in Australia haven't yet arrived. So even without additional approved employers, I'm expecting that number to increase significantly, but we're certainly not having a break in interest in the scheme. So I think the last that I had checked, we had about 20 applications from approved employers in the various stages of assessment. In terms of gender, the Pacific Labour Scheme is doing well with close to 50% gender balance for participation of men and women. And increasing women's participation is one of our objectives. But it's not just about participation, it's also about increasing women's skills and women's economic empowerment. Some of you may have heard the ABC Radio Pacific Beat program this week. It's running a series of shows on the Pacific Labour Scheme. So far the series has covered perspectives from a worker, Pacific Government, a Pacific Chamber of Commerce, and DFAT and academic perspectives. One Australian academic raised the issue of negative social impact when mothers particularly participate in the program and the impact that that can have on families and children. I think this will be an issue of ongoing debate, which it should be. DFAT will certainly be paying attention to this issue. The Pacific Labour Scheme is the new approach, and we need to do research, we need to monitor, we need to evaluate, so that all the partners can make informed decisions and choices, so that program adaptation can happen as we learn and as we implement. Relevant participatory research and evaluation will be critical. I'd just like to pause here for a moment and just check in with the audience and do a quick straw poll on your study backgrounds. So I wonder if I could just have a show of hands of how many people in the room have a background in economics. Maybe close to half with an economics background. Law? Yep, a few lawyers. Politics? A few people with politics background. What about science? Great. What about other social sciences? Okay, so we have a good mix in the room. I asked this question because I think in reflection of some of the debate so far at the update, and also in relation to labour mobility, I wonder whether sometimes our academic background is the lens through which we approach some of these issues. And I think being transparent and open about our perspectives and our assumptions might help our debate. I think sometimes in debates, both sides have evidence to kind of defend their position, but that sometimes leaves us in an intractable position. And I think in the context of labour mobility, both Australia and Pacific governments need to be, making decisions and need to be informed. And so I think if we can have an open and transparent debate, that will help us all. It's absolutely essential that I think we include in our analysis on the impact of labour mobility both economic and social analysis, which will help inform decisions of both government but also citizens. To finish, I'd just like to quote the Secretary from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Frances Adamson, from her recent address at the Australasian Aid Conference at ANU. She said that it is strongly in Australia's interest that the people of our region are able to realise the benefits of economic prosperity. And she also said that when development partners invite us to make a contribution to their internal development challenges, they do so on the basis of one fundamental premise. The focus has always been and absolutely remains that country's development. Through poverty reduction, prosperity and stability. That's a privilege that we must continue to earn. That's how we build the development partnerships that yield opportunity, security and strength. Labour mobility is more than a development program, and I know that this is an issue of debate and discussion around the context of labour mobility and how it's situated. And it is more than a development program because of the direct role of Australian employers. They are the ultimate decision makers of who they recruit and who they employ. And it isn't necessarily a development program for them. And it may not be a development program for the Pacific citizens either. And I don't think it has to be. But in order to create more opportunities for the people of our region and to realise economic prosperity, we do use a development approach. But we also need to use an approach that really effectively engages with the private sector and with Australian employers. So to finish, I think it's important to note that Pacific labour mobility can't be all things to all people, but it can, and it does, recognise Australia's special relationship with the Pacific. It should enable prosperity and integration, economic prosperity and integration, both in the Pacific but also in Australia. And it also needs to prioritise worker welfare and value the people-to-people links and community links formed through the links between Pacific citizens and Australian employers. Laucala Campus.
Thank you, Jane, for that update. And ladies and gentlemen, I think we're now waiting for the main academic paper by Professor John Cornell. Professor, your work still very much read by our students, undergrad, postgrad alike. So thank you. So we'll leave it much flexible between Professor Cornell and Christy as to how they want to structure their presentation.
Okay, good morning all. Thank you very much for enabling me and Kirsty to be a participant in this important day-long session, particularly as I put my hand up as an other social scientist, and we other social scientists don't always get to the forefront, so it's rather nice to be here. Indeed, it's an honour and a pleasure to be part of what should be an interesting, enjoyable, and I hope exciting workshop where we bring a lot of things together. I was asked to provide a sort of global overview of where these schemes come from, how they exist and so on, and then we move into what is happening in New Zealand and Australia. Kirsty's going to talk more about the details, and I'm going to come back at sort of the end and try and think about the future of these kind of schemes. I should emphasize that what we've been doing is very much a desk study. We've never got out of our offices, so we haven't had the great pleasure and privilege of getting out to the countries, and let alone getting out to the farms and talking to the workers and the farmers and so on to see what is actually going on. So we're missing a lot of gaps, and I think one of the exciting things, the potential for today is to fill in some of those gaps, because there's so many people in this room who've been there, done that, and can put more flesh on the bones that we'll set out right now. Okay, I think it's certainly a cliche to say that the world is more connected than ever before, that we've entered into a new age of migration, people moving much more than ever before. There's unprecedented interest in migration, and unprecedented numbers. If we think, for example, the number of refugees, it's reached an all-time high. But at the same time, there's also unprecedented borders, and I think that's really important. Think about borders have never been so significant as they now in the past as they are now. So if we think of President Trump's attempt to build a wall, we think about Brexit, which was in some ways a wall against migration from Eastern Europe, and particularly most strongly in the parts of England which benefited most from migrant workers working in agriculture, which I thought was rather interesting. There are obviously diverse possibilities for migration. There are all kinds of opportunities, from desperate, impoverished refugees, through illegal migrants, through families, to skilled workers, and so on and so forth. And this is where, in a sense, global guest workers are just a small part of this grand panorama. And that has experienced, I think, a quite remarkable regrowth from the late 20th century into the present day. So it began, global guest workers, I think how most people think about them, was something that began after the Second World War. Particularly, most people point to the migration of Turks to work in Germany, and then it sort of faded away for time, but has now revived in the late 20th century. Canada bringing in workers from Mexico and the Caribbean, and now what is happening in this region in New Zealand and Australia. So, all this fits into, of course, a Pacific context of migration as well. Things that Stephen Howes and David Abbott talked about in more detail yesterday. But we live in a region of migration. And I think there are three important trends which are probably more than familiar to everybody in this room. Rural-urban migration, urbanization. Think about places like Fiji, 60% urban now. And the loss of populations in many outer islands. So the margins are fading, populations are becoming more concentrated at the center. Long-term international migration now, since the 1960s, the global long boom, 60 years of migration from places like Samoa and Tonga to New Zealand, spilling over from Polynesian states to Micronesian states through their compacts of free association, taking people from the island states to the margins of the Pacific. So that, as Stephen talked about yesterday, many more Cook Islanders living overseas than at home, multiple more Niueans living overseas than at home. So the new culture of migration. So this fits into where migration is seen by many to be normative. It's what you do, it's what you're expected to do. After all, many people have more relatives overseas than at home. So there's that long-term migration, which has created a culture of migration in some places and specific niches also. We think about skilled migration, for example, the migration of health workers and teachers, many parts of the region, a particular kind of flow. Or if we're thinking about Fiji, we think about the particular flow of rugby players to other countries in the world as well. So particular kinds of skilled migration. And then we have short-term, temporary and circular migration. Not a new thing. Something was happening for countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu way back when it was the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, workers going to Nauru for off and on for half a century, and later on being trained to work as workers on shipping lines, mainly German shipping lines and so on. So there's a history in some places of training workers for migration to be involved in the global labour markets. There are all kinds of ways this might happen. Family migration, skilled migration, lotteries, green card lotteries in America, Pacific access schemes in New Zealand. So the whole different set of mechanisms by which people might migrate. There also, I think it's important to say, there's one particular non-trend which is interesting, and that is the limited minimal migration within the Pacific migration itself. So some Pacific region itself. So some, thank you, some short-term localized migration in the region, but not significant migration. When we think about migration in the Pacific, it is to the fringes, to the rim of the Pacific. Okay, so we're going to ask, does migration contribute to development? It's there, it's significant. Lots of people are migrants. Does it work? Does it add value? Kenneth Galbraith wrote in 1979, one of his lesser-known works, migration, we have seen, is the oldest action against poverty. It selects those who most want help. It's good for the country to which they go. It helps to break the equilibrium of poverty in the country from which they come. What is the perversity in the human soul that causes people to so resist such an obvious good? A sentiment that my Irish grandparents would adhere to, and therefore I too must be seen as a beneficiary of migration. But I think in many ways the answer is not quite so obvious. It depends on the nature of migration. It depends on how we think about what this thing called development actually is. And so at the moment, I guess most people tend to think about it in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. If we go back to day one of this conference, and Winston Buchanan opening off the session, talking about how ways of thinking about development have evolved very quickly over the last quarter of a century, from thinking initially about growth, then to thinking about growth and development, then to thinking about growth and development in the environment, then to thinking about growth, development in the environment and gender, and then to think about all those things and basic needs. So all kinds of changes, and they've been quite rapid at times and helped us to think of it, helped us reframe the ways in which we think about what this thing called development actually is. And at the same time, there's these strands which we've heard, depending on what session you were in yesterday, about particular ways that relate to the Pacific. As Apelli Hauhofer said a long time ago, it is time to create things for ourselves. And quoting, and again, as was quoted in one of the sessions yesterday, the Samoan Prime Minister, ourselves, our values, our identity, harking back to a Pacific way of the 1960s and 70s. So there are different ways of thinking about what this thing called development is and how it relates to the region. It's also, I think, significant to ask, when we're talking about Pacific Island countries, how can one size fit all when they're so different? So you have Papua New Guinea, a country of more than 8 million people, a mining economy, exports of multiple cash crops. Tuvalu, less than 10,000 people, few resources. Can it be the development model, development aspirations that fit one of those countries fits both of them? And again, even within those countries, development strategies have changed. If you think about Kiribati, for example, and Anote Tong, the previous president, migration with dignity was part of what he was talking about. The present president, the new president, Mama, talking much more about outer islands, about doing our development for our people rather than worrying about what's going on somewhere else. So these things change all the time. Okay, and within this context then, guest workers have returned. The rise of RSE, then SWP, then the PLM labour migration schemes. Why have they arisen? Because the countries have wanted them, certainly. But is that to do with economic expediency, the need for labour at this moment in time? Is it to do with political expediency? What are the significant factors that have generated this particular rise at this particular moment in time? Whatever the factors are, guest worker migration is promoted as a quadruple win. A win for the workers, a win for the employers, and a win for the two countries which are involved. So widely seen by all the countries participating in the scheme as beneficial. And in that, in there, I think we've seen consistently over the last 10 years, when thinking about the scheme, The primacy of economics. We almost always go back to the income that can be earned, significantly more than in the home countries, and the way that that income is then transferred back as remittances, and the values that those remittances have for households and countries back at home. And I think it's important to say that it's not just about economics, it's also about social development and social change as well. I think in some ways that's been a little bit neglected when we thought about these guest worker schemes, and again, when we thought about what development actually is. So I think there's a number of cautionary tales which are worth saying before we move on. And they add in some ways the 7 cautionary moments that Stephen had yesterday. How can we think about future labour markets? Right now there is clearly demand. What will happen to labour markets in the future? We know that at the moment these are expanding, so one of the present important features of the scheme is that they're extending now from agricultural employment into areas like caring, into areas like tourism, meatpacking, and so on. So there's a big market, an expanding market at the moment. Will that always be so? Or will the market be in the same place? Solomon Islands are now going, some of them, to work in Canada. Will the market be somewhere else in future? What about alternative labour sources? Backpackers may stage a revival. Bangladeshis flooded out if climate change happens, may be given greater priority. Machinery may be given greater priority than workers. How do we think about temporary workers compared with permanent migration? It's sometimes said that we called for workers, but we gained people. What happens if those workers begin to stay? Will there be a reaction against them? Will there be populist barriers, as there are as we well know, in large parts of Europe now, in America and so on? A distant future perhaps, but not very far from how we think about many of these things. And I think it reflects that while we have clearly today the priority of thinking about labour migration, I think it's really important to situate that within a context of diversity that as David Abbott emphasised yesterday, if you were in that session, that we mustn't merely focus on migration as the key to development in the region. There are indeed other things. And I was listening to the radio last week with the president of Salvador saying, we want to be a country, not where people migrate to the United States, we want to be a country where people are proud to remain. So there are other ways of thinking about this as well. And what that means is that we need, when we think about these things and some of the other things I've talked about a moment ago, that we need a much better understanding of what it's all about. And this is where I think we came from to try and develop in this, the overview that Kirsty's mainly going to talk about now, a better understanding of what is going on now, so that we can shape the future better for all the Pacific Island countries and their workers from those island states.
Okay, so getting down into the labour mobility schemes, when we're talking about Pacific labour mobility, we're specifically interested in New Zealand's recognised seasonal employer scheme and Australia's seasonal worker program and the Pacific Labour Scheme. It is also worth noting though that there are a couple of other schemes that do operate in the Pacific. As John just mentioned, Canada is now recruiting from the Solomon Islands, and there's also a South Korean scheme as well. The RSE and the SWP are both quite similar in that they fill gaps in the horticultural industry, and contracts last for less than 12 months. In contrast, the PLS is aimed at low and semi-skilled industries, and contracts last for significantly longer, up to 3 years. And it's also worth just emphasising the RSE isn't just recruiting from the Pacific Islands. There are other countries that can work through the RSE as well. In terms of rates of participation, some of you would have seen these numbers yesterday in Stephen's presentation, but it does vary quite a lot between countries as to how many workers they're sending to Australia and New Zealand. Vanuatu and Tonga have been clear leaders numerically, both in Australia and New Zealand, and this is in part because they were two of the first countries to participate in the scheme. Samoa has also been a large contributor of labour to the RSE. And some other countries such as Kiribati, Nauru, have been having to overcome barriers such as remoteness to participate in the scheme. And you can see that their numbers are quite low as a result. But it is important to emphasise that these numbers are constantly changing, so just because it looks like this at the moment doesn't mean that other countries won't contribute more labour in the future. And it is also worth just noting that in terms of Pacific Islanders who are participating in the RSC, the SWP has now overtaken the RSC in terms of numbers. Looking at the PLS, participation rates are quite different in terms of which countries are contributing labour. Early numbers suggest that countries such as Kiribati and Tuvalu might contribute more labour to the PLS than they have to the SWP. And this is in part because DFAT has put in a really big effort to try and overcome some of these issues relating to remoteness that have meant participation in the SWP has been harder for these countries. Vanuatu, Samoa and Fiji are also expected to be large players in the PLS, but it is early days yet, so it will be really interesting to see how these numbers play out. And it is quite likely that certain countries will come to specialise in certain industries as their workers become known within these industries. In terms of gender, as Stephen mentioned yesterday, the horticultural schemes have been dominated by men. So the average worker is a married man aged in his early 30s. This is in part because things like marriage, having children, and being aged 30 or above have been used as a proxy for selecting people who are likely to be responsible, who are likely to be good workers and not muck around. Women's participation has sat at around 13% in the past, but as Stephen mentioned yesterday, the latest figures for the SWP show that women are now accounting for 18% of participants in the SWP, but it is still mostly a male-dominated scheme. And this is due to several factors. Home countries have often been reluctant to send women to participate in the scheme because their place has been seen as being in the home, looking after the children, and men are often reluctant to take over this role if it is their wives who participate. Host country employers have often also had preferences for male employees, and this is in part because the kinds of work that people are doing under the SWP and the RSC are seen as being suitable for men. So men have been favoured for things like picking fruit, pruning and so forth, but women are often seen as more suitable for work in packing sheds. So there is a bit of a gender division in the kinds of work that SWP and RSC workers have been doing. Again, looking at gendered participation under the PLS, it seems likely that women are going to account for, and Jane just mentioned as well, they're accounting for a much greater proportion of participants under the PLS. And this has important implications for research because, not surprisingly, most of the existing research has focused on the experiences of men purely because they are the ones who are participating at a greater rate. Industries such as care work and hospitality are likely to have a large number of women or be dominated by women, but it is likely that men are going to continue to dominate in industries such as forestry, meat processing, fishing and aquaculture. And we've got an image here of an information session that took place in Port Vila for the PLS and the meat packing industry, and you can see there aren't many women at all visible in that image. Moving on to some of the findings from the research into what research exists. We don't really know a lot about how or why workers are selected or nominate themselves to participate in the scheme, but it does seem that financial goals are really important. Sometimes communities will play a role in nominating or selecting workers, and they'll often choose people who are seen to be the most needy or trustworthy, people who will do the communities proud. But this isn't always the case, and there's some research by the World Bank that indicates that communities don't always play as big a role in the process as they might like. Some countries have favoured work-ready pools, so this is where they get basically a group of workers who are ready to be deployed as employers need them. Others have focused on using recruiting agents as an intermediary. And in Vanuatu in particular, there have been a lot of issues around recruiting agents who are charging fees that they shouldn't.
and also people who are parading themselves as recruiting agents, so taking a lot of money from people, promising jobs, and these jobs just don't appear. Accessing information about the scheme relies quite heavily on personal contacts and networks, so if you know people who have participated in the scheme already, it's more likely that you're going to participate yourself. And there was a comment after Stephen's presentation yesterday about how this can lead to potential inequality both within communities, within islands, and so forth if you've got groups of people who are excluded from the scheme. Initially, the RSE and the SWP were aimed at bringing development to rural areas. So not surprisingly, some governments have targeted rural areas as places that they recruit from, but we don't really know a lot about why they're choosing particular areas or even if any kind of consistent criteria is being applied. As the benefits of the scheme have become more well known, it seems that there are more and more urban people participating in the scheme, but this is quite hard to measure because you do often get people moving from rural areas in order to access the opportunities for the scheme. But it does seem that under the PLS, as more and more skilled and semi-skilled people are being recruited, it's likely that we will get more urban participants, largely just because people with these kinds of existing skills are more likely to be living in urban areas already. And this does have important implications for research in that most of the existing research has focused on rural communities and the impacts of participation in the scheme on rural areas. So based on this we do need a lot more research into how and why regions and individuals are choosing to participate, what are the barriers and facilitators to participation. And it would be really valuable if we could start charting the kinds of characteristics of people who are participating and not participating, gender, education, household size, these kinds of things, so that we can look at how these patterns might change over time or if they're not changing and why. Moving on to the experiences of host communities. The horticultural industry has often been plagued by unstable workforces, people coming and going, the need to retrain, which is both expensive and takes a lot of time. So employers have undoubtedly benefited from the scheme through stable workforces. There have been real productivity gains. In New Zealand, there's evidence of employers who have been able to expand the area under cultivation as a result of the scheme. In general, it seems that workers have been welcomed by their host communities, and as the same workers are coming back year after year, they're starting to form relationships, both platonic and otherwise, with local community members. But we don't really know a lot about how this is playing out. There's no real detailed, accessible research into this. There is some research by Helen Lee and Makiko Nishitani that suggests that in areas where there are large existing Pacific communities who do rely on the horticultural industry for employment, that these seasonal workers do have the potential to push some of these longer-term migrants out of work. But this is restricted, this study was restricted to one area in rural Australia, so we really don't know how widespread this is. In contrast, it also seems that existing Pacific Islander populations might be able to play a really important role in providing pastoral care, links to the community, and so forth. So we really don't know what's going on here. Workers do seem to bring economic benefits to their communities. There are cases in New Zealand where second-hand stores have expanded because they're really popular with the workers who are both buying things to use while they're in country and also sending things home to their families. But we don't really know a lot of detail about how these economic flows work, and we do need more research into how they're playing out. Along with this, it would be really useful to have some more case studies about the kinds of interactions that are occurring between the workers, their host communities, how are they interacting with the local workforce, and so forth. In terms of how the workers themselves are experiencing the host communities, before workers depart, they're given pre-departure briefings in their home country and then arrival briefings when they arrive in Australia or New Zealand. And these cover things like how to use bank accounts, basic first aid, what are the cultural norms in the place you're going to. There are booklets and materials available to workers in their home country languages, but it seems that these aren't always utilised. And so when the briefings are delivered in English, it can lead to information overload and just a whole lot of confusion. World Bank research does indicate that the quality of these briefings seems to vary quite a lot, largely dependent on the amount of funding that's available to deliver them. There's been a lot of media attention about issues relating to underpayments of workers, and there have been a couple of large settlements for workers who were underpaid that have gone through the Fair Work Ombudsman recently. And this is in part due to the culture of the horticultural industry in Australia. It has in the past relied very heavily upon cash-in-hand work, under-the-table work and similar arrangements. As Stephen mentioned yesterday, this is being cleared up to some extent now. But it does mean that workers often seem to be quite concerned that maybe the deductions that are on their pay slip aren't legitimate, and are they being cheated out of pay as a result. Some research has noted that workers find separation from their families quite difficult, but again, there's no real detailed research looking into how this works. We do know that remitting is very expensive. The Pacific is one of the most expensive regions in the world to remit, and so most workers will remit most of their savings in a lump sum towards the end of their contracts. But again, this varies between countries and also depends a lot on what is being expected by home communities. Due to the nature of the industries that seasonal workers are working in, they're often placed in remote locations, and so this can lead to things like feelings of loneliness, social isolation, and of course there's the climatic differences between Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific. Churches and soccer tournaments and other sporting events seem to have played a really important role in bridging gaps between the local community and workers. In New Zealand, there's been some rather large RSC worker soccer tournaments that have been organised. And we need to consider better how we can overcome these potential issues of social isolation and so forth. So overall, again, it would be really useful to have some more qualitative case studies looking at workers from a variety of different countries, working in different industries and placed in different areas in Australia, so that we can start to figure out what are the commonalities of experience, what is specific to particular places, say in Australia or New Zealand or the Pacific. And just to highlight some of these issues that I've been talking about, some of you may have heard about the case of the Samoan workers who were expelled from New Zealand's RSE scheme last week sometime due to issues such as misbehaviour, drinking, extramarital affairs. And this really just emphasises that things like this are still cropping up. The programs are in some ways still a work in progress. And it does seem that these kinds of issues are only occurring in a minority of cases. They don't seem to be widespread, but we don't know very much about the numbers at all, and it is possible that as numbers continue to increase, we may see some more of these kinds of issues. So relating to this, the social transformations and impacts at home, there hasn't been a lot of research into how the absence of workers might impact home communities or households. Wives left behind are often expected to make up for the lost labour of their husbands, and it seems that, for example, women in Vanuatu with young children often find it the hardest to make up for these labour losses. So as more women come to participate in labour mobility through the PLS, it will be really important to consider what absent wives mean for home communities. There's only really one existing study of the gendered impacts of labour mobility, and this focuses on Vanuatu and Tonga. It indicates that participation in labour mobility might increase open-mindedness about women's place in society, but it's not really clear how widespread this is, whether it's long-term or not. There's quite a bit of concern in home countries over gender-based violence that is resulting from participation in the scheme, and also family breakdown. Most of the evidence around this is anecdotal, so we don't know a lot about the extent, how this is playing out. Is it fears of affairs, or are they affairs that are actually happening? There are stories of people coming home with new partners, women coming home pregnant, but we just don't know very much about the actual extent of how it is happening. Skills transfer has been one of the benefits of the scheme that's been promoted, but there isn't a lot of evidence of what you can consider hard skills being transferred back to home countries. In part, this is just because the kinds of industries that, well, particularly horticulture, that workers are employed in, they're not farming at the same scale when they come home, and some of the crops they're working with, they just don't grow in Pacific countries. At the same time, there is some evidence that soft skills, things like time management, budgeting, are being used and can be valuable, particularly if workers are returning to work in mainly urban employment. But again, it's not really clear if these are relevant to more rural environments. As low and semi-skilled workers are recruited into the PLS, it's likely that home countries are going to experience some skills losses. And Stephen mentioned this yesterday. There was an article recently from Vanuatu that suggested that maybe they should only be recruiting the unemployed into the scheme, and there was quite a bit of outcry about this from the general population. It wasn't seen as a popular approach. There has been one study in Vanuatu that suggests that participation in the scheme has the potential to lead to food insecurity. As workers are away, they're not planting their gardens, they come home, they've been working hard in New Zealand and they just want to rest. So they're not planting subsistence gardens, they have the money to buy food from stores, and so they're starting to rely more and more on food imports, which has implications particularly if shipments of food are delayed, as they often are in the Pacific, and also in terms of health. If you're suddenly eating a lot of very highly processed foods, there are going to be health implications as well. So we do need to focus more on these kinds of impacts, particularly as periods of absence are set to increase under the PLS. And again, qualitative case studies are going to be really useful in understanding some of the nuances around these issues. And again, comparative studies between different countries, different industries of employment and so forth. And John's now going to take you through the economic impacts at home.
Okay, I shall be brief. As is apparent from what you've heard from Kirsty as the substance of the report, too often we've had to proceed, if you like, by assumption, i.e. if it worked in Vanuatu 10 years ago like this, then it probably works in Tonga right now like that, which is not a very effective way of actually doing things. And it also proceeds sometimes by anecdote and unfortunately sometimes by media. So the media obviously catch on to exciting things like extramarital affairs, drunkenness and car crashes, and it's obviously a minority experience, but nonetheless those are the things that tend to hit the headlines. In contrast to what we know of the social aspects of the guest worker schemes, what we know about the economic impacts is at least a little better, thanks to a lot of early work that was done mostly now a decade ago. So very clearly remittances are extremely significant compared with local incomes, and those, as far as we know in most cases, and this again tends to be an assumption, are used to do some of the obvious things like building better houses, paying school fees, meeting immediate food needs, water supplies and so on. And then it goes into small business development, things like bakeries, sometimes taxi businesses, sometimes small stores and so on. These new economic flows create new kinds of social relationships. We don't know much about how those work, whether there's frustration and tensions because of those, and if they've led to inequality and so on. But at least we know a little bit more about the economic aspects than we do about some of the social aspects. So we decided what we would do was draw up a sort of matrix of what we know and what we don't know by countries and by sort of categories of research. So across the top you can see a number of headings like recruitment, briefings, workplace experiences and so on, right across to food security, I think is there somewhere. And then we've sort of ticked off countries where some of that work seems to have been done. And you can see that there's an enormous number of blanks on that matrix. And indeed, if we think about it even harder, some of that work has been, a lot of the work Vanuatu scores more ticks than anywhere else, but it may mean that a particular study has been done in Southeast Ambrim or Northeast Tanna 10 years ago or 5 years ago and doesn't necessarily reflect on contemporary circumstances in Vanuatu, where much has evolved and much has changed. In some other countries, Kiribati and Tuvalu, we know very little at all about the impact, perhaps slight, of what the guest worker schemes have been. So hopefully, by the end of the day, those of you who have not been tied to your desk like we have will begin to fill in at least some of those gaps. We know, of course, that a lot of that work is going on, not yet necessarily come to fruition and publication, and that some of those gaps will be filled, but there are a lot of gaps that are still there to be done in due course. So it seemed to us that, and this is something we'll come back to in the last session, that it is important to set certain kind of research priorities based on what we need to know and what we don't know at the moment. At this point, early in the morning, which seems like early in the morning to me, we're sort of fairly reluctant to suggest what absolute priorities and places are. I mean, it's really important to hear the views of countries and participants in this and what they think about the particular schemes. But we certainly, it seems to us, need to know more about how selection works, who is being recruited, how, why those people, and what the barriers to participation are. Are there geographical barriers? Are there social barriers? What are the barriers to participation? What is the development impact? Fairly obviously, housing, health, education, and so on. Fairly obvious questions, and indeed, what of those remittances goes into investment, and how is that investment sustained? Do businesses last a decade, 2 decades, although they keel over quite quickly? And if they do, does that matter? What about the gender implications, because you just talked about, really, really important, and particularly more and more, which will become much more important as the schemes become broader. People stay longer beyond the 6 or 7 months they do at the moment, stay more than a year without their families. What implication will that have as well? Return migration, we need tracer studies, I think, of who's going back, what happens to them. We don't have many of those. We need to know about the social lives of the workers, their access to rights, welfare and services to make sure the scheme is in fact working properly, benefiting everybody equitably. We need to know really about the employer concerns. We have had surveys done on that in Australia, but we need to know much more, I think. We need to know also about regional experiences within Australia that's clearly different from place to place. So finally, we also need to think about how this might be done. Who is going to do these kinds of things? How are we going to expand our knowledge base? So we need, I think, good linkages. This is why we are here at USP, to see what USP might fit into this kind of work in the various USP countries. It'd be nice to work with the Forum Secretariat, SBC, and so on, as institutions who are committed to positive development change in the region. We need, I think, more studies of migrant workers that have been done by people who speak the languages of those migrant workers. Very little of that, with rare exceptions in Vanuatu particularly, exists. We need to know much more where people talk in their own terms, in their own words, about their own priorities and their own interests. We have suggested some priority countries there. We could argue why that is so. I think Tuvalu and Kiribati, because they have by and large missed out on these schemes thus far. How can we better integrate them? How can we work to make that more successful for those 2 countries? We don't know much about Timor either. Vanuatu, you might think, is rather odd, maybe because we like Vanuatu, but Vanuatu is a place where we do have good studies, but the point of that is that we can build on those studies. We can do longitudinal studies there, which we can't do in other places because the prior work doesn't exist. And I think also, finally, we've written new industries at the end there. Now these guest work is expanding into other areas like caring, like meat packing, like tourism. Let's find out now what's happening there as these industries begin to take up workers, how that is working, and how we can make that succeed more effectively as well. So finally, thank you, Tomas, and that's all.
Thank you, Professor John. And Christy, can we invite all the panelists to the table, please? The boss decided to stay away, so that's fine. Thank you, colleagues. I think we have some time for question and answers. So we have some mics floating around the table. In the room. We have someone there.
Hi, my name is Chelsea Boris. I'm a student at the ANU. I have a question for John and Kirsty. I'm curious as to where you think reform needs to occur to prevent entire villages from being blacklisted from the programs in the future.
Probably we'll take a few. So next one there.
Richard Curtin from the Development Policy Centre. John and Kirsty, one thing I think is missing from your list of research topics, and that is the political economy changes that labour mobility represents and how different it is from the relationship between donor and recipients. It seems to me that labour mobility itself requires a much more bilateral, much more give and take on the part of the sending and receiving countries. And looking at the way in which that operates across countries is going to be an important part of understanding how labour mobility can actually become a new paradigm for the way the sending and receiving countries relate to each other. And it raises issues about the extent of investment that the sending countries are putting into the way in which they're preparing workers and helping workers make the most of their savings when they return. And in the case of the receiving countries, it requires a high level of coordination between agencies. It requires all sorts of commitments to working on a continuing basis to address a range of the complexities that exist in a labour mobility arrangement.
Yeah, thank you. We'll just take one question from here.
Thank you very much. A couple of points for John and Kirsty. One of the things that I didn't see in your list was an analysis of the economic impacts, the opportunity costs of people moving away from the rural areas. I think it was mentioned by Jane, that we could see changes in diets as a consequence of people coming back. And I think that these things need to be looked at. And I have to say that I was very surprised to see Putasi mentioned in that article, because that has been one of the villages in Tonga, I think, where they have actually tried to make sure that anyone who goes on these schemes planted 100 or so taro plants before they departed. And the Matai of that village is actually a very conscientious person, and I'm really surprised to see that they have now been blacklisted, because that's very disappointing. But I do think the opportunity cost needs to be looked at of the lost production and the transfer of diets to other foods and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll give time to John and Kirsty to respond, and then we'll take more.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first question, so I'll pass that to Kirsty. All I can say is I entirely agree with what Richard and David had said, and we could put that matrix up there. I think we did have food security there as one of the key issues that we do need to know much more about. And that's one that we certainly don't know much. There's one small study of one particular island in Vanuatu, a small one, that does look at the impact on food security, but I suspect the methodology is rather doubtful, and it would be nice to know much more. And what is happening in Samoa, it's really interesting in terms of getting people to do the agricultural work before they go. And indeed, as you said, it almost offers a model for what other places might do.
So in terms of how can we prevent blacklisting of villagers or workers, it's really something that comes from a few different perspectives or areas. So we see there's a lot of self-regulation going on amongst workers, so they're very worried that they will, if they drink or if they break other rules, maybe they'll be blacklisted from the scheme. Maybe that will lead to the scheme, participation in the scheme for their village being jeopardised or for their country. It does come down to employers to some extent. If they are saying, no, we're not going to take people from this village anymore because we've had bad experiences with them, because as I think it may have been Stephen who mentioned yesterday, or maybe it was Jane this morning, at the end of the day, it's the employers who decide who they're taking, how many people they're taking. But it is the question of if someone does something wrong, do we say, no, you can't do this anymore? There are so many other people who are waiting, who would like to participate in the scheme. The blacklisting does sometimes seem to come from home country governments or communities. So I guess the answer is there's no simple solution to that. And there's a range of people who are making these decisions.
Thank you. We have one question there from the corner, please.
Hi.
We'll take that one and then we'll come this side.
George Carter from the Australian National University. Just have a quick question. Out of the scheme in Germany, and I just wanted to know what happened for the scheme to end. I think we need to also, because this is based on supply and demand, what happens when that demand is met? So I'd like to know how and what were the reasons to which that scheme stopped, because it can also give us some ideas into our research how to avoid that and I guess the success of the program.
Thank you. Well, we'll come to that. Now I'm looking at this one, my friends in the corner, and one here and one there. So we'll take 4 this time.
Good morning. Joe Maniwai from the School of Governance. Because the scheme is all about money. These are issues that have been raised there about the remittance, the funds, the charges been levied of the expensive of carrying out that exercise. I would be very interested if there is a schedule been given to us, the amount of charges been levied by the Australia outlets and the New Zealand outlets, of how much they are charging the Pacific people compared to other countries. Thank you.
Thank you. That'll be very interesting, I guess. We take a question here. Yeah, okay, the mic's there, so we stick there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Eberhard Weber from School of Geography here at USP. As over there somebody asked about Germany, I'm from Germany. About the time when I was born, the 1 millionth guest worker after the war was welcomed to Germany and he received a scooter. I think this wouldn't happen today. That means it has changed enormously. If we go down a bit more into history, the black-birded people brought to Queensland, Australia at the beginning of the 20th century, many of them were sent back. And now to present time, what gives the assurance that these schemes work only if the economic situation back home in Australia or New Zealand work? That means, what is the legal foundation of it? I understand they were introduced unilaterally, and the memorandum of understandings that exist, I assume they are based on the operational thing, but not on the big question whether they are or whether they are not. you would say, of course, that's the sovereignty of a government to decide of how many people they welcome or not. But if we go to the trade side, there the WTO, the Temporary Movement of Natural Persons, and so on, has a much stronger issue, or trade in commodities. It is much stronger codified and not so easy for countries to adjust it to their own requirements, own economic requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Weber. Take the last one of this slot.
Hello, good morning. Name is Semisi Taumoepeau from Tonga. And just to make some comments on the things that we are currently starting in Tonga to enhance and work with the scheme from the Tongans coming to Australia and New Zealand. I'm currently doing a project for Tonga Skills. Tonga Skills is a aid project from the Australian government. And what we're doing right now, we are establishing 7 national qualifications on tourism and hospitality, level 3, level 4. And part of the intention of that particular project is to further educate and enhance people in our labor force who may be picked for traveling to Australia and New Zealand, that they would have the equivalent of the New Zealand, Australian level 3, level 4 in tourism and hospitality, and hopefully that would help them in their selections for participation in the labor scheme. Initially, it was intended for our school leavers, about 6,000 every year coming off from year 11. But we just talked about it a couple of years ago, and we thought this may be very useful as well for the seasonal workers leaving from Tonga. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a comment rather than a question. So, Professor, probably there are 3 questions for you to answer.
I think the only one I can really talk to at all is the question about Germany and Turkey. And to add to what Eberhard said, as I understand it, there were 2 critical changes. One of those was in the national economy of Germany, that less workers were required for agricultural development because the economy rapidly moved away from that to its industrial growth. And secondly, that there was the demand for workers for reconstruction post-World War II was no longer needed as well. But there was also, and the other critical factor was considerable political opposition to the migration of workers from Turkey. And that is, after all, the quintessential place where we ask for workers, but they sent people. It really applies. I can't answer the other questions, but all those people who put their hands up as lawyers can answer those ones.
I can answer some. To the question on remittances, I think it's a great question, and it really is in all of our interests to reduce the cost of remittances to the Pacific. There is a website called Send Money Pacific that enables you to go and compare the cost of remittances from different providers. So that is a service that's meant to empower people to help inform them, make the best decision around, what's the best option for them in choosing a provider from remittances. I know it's not the full solution, but it is something that's available. And on the question of the legal foundation for labour schemes, I did talk about the bilateral MOUs between governments that enables the visa. But in terms of employment, the legal foundation is the Fair Work Act. So in Australia, Pacific employers have exactly the same entitlements as all Australians. So they have the same entitlement to wages and conditions as would an Australian in the same position. So it's the same kind of employment entitlements through the Fair Work Act.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Professor. Now, we'll take one question here. Okay. Our friends excited about it. Yeah, we'll make it 2, not a problem.
Thank you for the presentation on the label. I don't know if it's a question or a comment. If you look back another 100 years, we've had the Grimitiers that came from India, and also the blackbirding of Solomon Islanders to Queensland. It seems like, I'm just listening for the first time to this, it seems like the same thing is happening, only this time it's like official. And I'm just wondering, because as a Pacific Islander, and as a landowner, why are we putting some kind of boundaries between the islanders and Australia? During World War, we were the ones that helped Australia and New Zealand. During times of crisis, we were the ones that come and help Australia and New Zealand. Why don't we just open it up for the Pacific Islanders? We are not like war-torn countries like Syria. We will be the one that help Australia and New Zealand in the future. I just wonder if you can research on that and opening it for us, for the brothers and sisters in the Pacific, and treat us like brothers and sisters, not like cattle and dogs in the dog pound. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Jane can answer that for you, but a little later. I will take one question again from there.
Thanks. First question I would like to pose on Jane. Thank you for the contribution and the discussions that we have had. My question to you, Jane, is, and probably to John as well, on the migration and the labor mobility, that how has it been policed when people from the Middle East, from Pakistanis, from Bangladesh, from Europe, enter into the Pacific and use it as an entry point to New Zealand, Australia, and America? How are you policing this? That is one of the questions. Secondly, I think, John, you raised a point regarding the people that come into Australia and are being invited back. How are they performing in their communities? I have seen from first-hand experience from relatives that come in. I think you've related properly that some of them are reluctant to go into the field to do their farming. They're so reliable on the remittance that they have brought home and the income that they have generated. And once that runs out, they're looking at going back. But what is the impact that they have brought into the society? Probably, and the third question that I would like to raise probably to John and Jane is on the agreement that you have, the bilateral agreement between governments, is there a training session that has been done to equip participants that comes over how to manage their funds? Because mostly, a lot of them come home and are again broke. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there are about 4 or 5 questions, so we'll answer them first before we move on to the next probably few questions. Yeah,
Thanks.
Jane?
I'll start. Look, I think, I also put my hand up as another social scientist. So my background of study is anthropology. And I take your point as a comment, and I think, history and politics and context is really important. And these schemes certainly are, happening within, a particular, context, and that there is certainly history in terms of migration, and you've referred to blackbirding. But back to my earlier point around, entitlements under law, people from the Pacific are being employed and paid the same that an Australian is paid. So they do have legal protections under Australian law and are employed under the Fair Work Act. And I think that's really important. But we also recognise that workers coming from the Pacific to Australia do have some vulnerabilities. So I think while they are employed and they're entitled to the exact same pay and conditions, they are vulnerable. And so in terms of the schemes, there is government support to prioritise worker welfare and to make sure that Australian employers are complying with their obligations. And if there are ever any concerns that people become aware of workers being exploited or some kind of trouble, then I just encourage everybody to raise that with the relevant authorities, to let the department know. We have organisations, the Fair Work Act, to investigate claims of exploitation or abuse, and we take those extremely seriously and follow through. And unfortunately, as Stephen and Kirsty pointed out, there have been some cases where people haven't been treated well and haven't been paid properly. But the Australian courts have dealt with those cases, and those approved employers are no longer able to participate in the schemes. So we do require that approved employers comply with the law and do have an additional requirement of regulation through the schemes in addition to their obligations as an Australian employer. So we do take worker welfare very seriously, and it is a critical part of the programs.
You've asked the key question on remittances. What is their role and what is their effective significance? Seems to me, at one point I probably read just about everything that had ever been written on remittances in the Pacific, and after all that, the jury, it seemed to me, is still out on whether remittances increase or decrease productivity, and it depends, to my mind, very much on the local circumstances, so the particular village economy or urban economy to which those remittances are flowing and how they actually flow. What we really do need, the only real consensus is that it shifts production away from agriculture into something else, to a more diverse service-related local system, but whether that is a major benefit or not is, again, open to question. But on balance, remittances are positive, but how they actually work and how that varies from place to place is still unresolved.
I realised there was one other question around policing. So in terms of migrants, kind of using the Pacific to enter Australia or New Zealand, through the labour mobility programs, that's really not such a high risk. So in terms of the MOU that we have with Pacific governments endorse the workers who participate in the scheme. So, I think that the risk of other countries using these schemes to participate are very low because national labour sending units, employment sending units are monitoring and managing the pools of workers who come. So I think it would be very obvious if there were other foreign nationals trying to come and access the schemes. And certainly from the Australian government side, it's a whole of government scheme, so the Department of Home Affairs also works with us in terms of managing visas. So I think those risks through this scheme are very low.
Thank you, Jane. Anything on the training, financial literacy and the like? Somebody asked from here.
Certainly. So in terms of financial literacy, it is a part of pre-departure training and also on-arrival briefing. I think, that what we hear from people's experience in the scheme is that if those conversations around financial literacy and financial planning happen very early before someone even starts their position, then that's likely to have, the best impact for both them as an individual but also their families. So it is a critical part of, it's one of those additional services that's provided through this scheme that financial literacy training is provided.
Thank you, Jane. Now we take...
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Sorry, we kind of hijacked the question and answer from this end.
I don't know why you want to hijack, but please do that.
My name is Quintelani. I'm the Director responsible for Gender, Youth and Culture in SPC under the Social Development Program. 2 questions and an observation. The first quick question is, what happens to the superannuation fund that workers engage in when they're in Australia? Are they allowed to take this money back with them when they return? If it's not allowed, what happens to the money? The second question relates to some of the things that Jane had reflected on in her address and also some of the things that came through in the research. So Jane, in your address, you reflected on the principles of equitable access and shared benefits. The research then touched on the biases around selection to do with youth and women across the labour mobility schemes. Now, given the increasing youth bulge and the challenge of youth unemployment in the region, how do we create a platform across the labour mobility schemes to ensure that there is shared benefits and there is equitable access for Pacific women and Pacific youth? Now, from SPC's perspective, we're happy to engage as a partner in this conversation to create those platforms and to ensure that that happens for our region. Now, the observation. The research, I think it's great, but I feel that it's very heavy on the perspective of the labour receiving country, but very weak on the perspective of the labour sending countries. and how I think as we have this conversation, particularly in a policy context, we need to have a balance in terms of perspectives. Now, the reason I say this, one of the things you've raised in the presentation is that press release on what happened in Samoa and the ban on the workers. As a Samoan and as a Samoan Matai, you need to understand my cultural context to appreciate where the Prime Minister is coming from. So this is the important context that needs to be taken into account when we have this kind of conversation. So that's my observation, and I'd like to think that for research pertaining to labor mobility, or for any research within the Pacific, we need to look at how we're bringing in a Pacific perspective, how we're understanding the Pacific context. After all, in the Pacific, everything is about context. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come to that. Professor Ron, you had a question?
Thank you. Ron Duncan from the Crawford School of Public Policy. It's a comment really, and picks up on the last comment that John made about really about economic development. Economic development is the important objective of the Australian government's project on seasonal workers. That's the main objective that's put forward. However, there's been some really good econometric work over many years looking at the relationship between remittances and economic growth. And we've been unable to find a relationship that remittances, and this goes right back to the big remitting countries, Mexico, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and all the rest, including the Pacific. We cannot find a relationship between remittances and economic growth. There's nothing to say that it adds to it. So we really should be thinking about remittances just as a way of overcoming poverty, which it does. All the evidence is that consumption improves, shelter improves, education improves, and health improves amongst those households. But it doesn't add to the productive capacity of the country. There's anecdotal stories about businesses starting up, but as John said at one point, they mostly fall over very quickly. It's obviously not sustained. And the question is, why is this happening? Why don't we get a response from all this money? And some countries like Mexico and the Philippines, there's just billions of dollars are earned in remittances. But as I say, it's really about poverty, solving poverty, not economic growth.
Thank you, Professor. One question there, please. And the last one, I think, at the top.
Thank you very much. I'm Mandy from APTC, and it's a question to John and Kirsty. I noticed when you went through your slides, you inadvertently omitted to elaborate on the research priorities for TVET and skills, and I'd be interested in just you giving us a bit more information about where you think the priorities are, and in particular whether you think we need to do some research, for example, on avoiding brain drain, and how do we quantify what net skills gain and the impact of labour mobility, for example, on strengthening TVET. Thank you.
Thank you. The very last question right at the top, please. And we'll then respond.
Hi, I'm Sadhna Sen. I'm a descender of a Girimit worker in Fiji. One of the things we haven't done in Fiji is we haven't done sharecropping with the indigenous Fijians. So as we've left for the greener shores of Australia, New Zealand to take on your jobs in Australia, New Zealand when your people don't want to do those jobs, we haven't left behind Fijians trained in doing cane farming. My question is, these schemes, particularly in Fiji, are now taking on the indigenous Fijian worker to Australia and New Zealand. Is there any way that these schemes, particularly in the agricultural sector, have value added in terms of not just remittances sent to Fiji, but in terms of training be added into the scheme, so that when our workers go and pick oranges or work on your cattle farms, etc., they can learn from what they do in Australia and New Zealand and come back and replicate some of those skills in Fiji, other than just picking your oranges and feeding your cattle and things like that. We've got a lot of land in the Pacific, in Fiji. It'd be great if these workers came back and were able to be better farmers, be better cattle ranchers or whatever they do when they come back home. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadhna. Now we have the panel to respond. Jane to start, please.
So in relation to the superannuation question, it's a great question, and it's really an issue that we are grappling with. So in Australia, all workers under the Pacific Labour schemes are entitled to superannuation, the same superannuation that Australians are entitled to. But the issue in terms of people accessing their superannuation, there are challenges. So people can't access their superannuation until they leave the country. So when they return home, they have to go through the process of applying to access that superannuation, which is theirs, it's their entitlement. But there are logistical challenges. People return to remote communities, they need to do an online form, it's difficult. And so there is a lot of superannuation money that, you know, workers, it's their entitlement, but that hasn't reached them yet. So we're working with the Department of the Australian Tax Office and the Department of Finance to try and look at some reforms, and with the Pacific Labour Facility. So I think it's both a short-term issue where we need to look at ways to help workers practically access, so help them do the online application form that they need to do, you know, look at the logistics of how the money is going to actually be delivered to them. But I think it's also an issue of longer term reform in terms of, you know, the process that's used. So we're looking at it both in terms of a short term issue but a longer term issue that requires some reform to make it more simple for workers to access. And it is an issue for Australian workers as well. I think there are a lot of Australian workers not accessing superannuation that's also owed to them. On the question of equitable access, particularly for women and youth, I think it's an excellent question, and I'm so glad that you encouraged your support to work with partners, because I think this is an issue where we need to be having the dialogue, we need to be having the discussion with our partners. And given that there is increased ambition at the moment, now is the time. So there is, you know, this ambition both from the Australian government but also from Pacific governments around labour mobility. So I think this is an issue that, you know, as partners, as Pacific governments, regional organisations, we need to have that dialogue about how we can make that happen. So I'll follow up with you on that issue. I think they were the only questions for me, so I'll pass to John.
Thanks. I would just endorse what Ron said about poverty and the welfare gains of remittances, which I should have added into certainly the welfare part, and particularly housing in terms of the benefits of remittances. In terms of the issues about skills and brain drain, we didn't really talk much about those for two reasons. One, because there haven't been a lot of studies about skill transfer, and much of the literature on brain drain that exists for the Pacific region focuses on health workers and teachers rather than the workers who are involved in the RSC and SWP schemes. So we don't know much about that, and if you saw our table, you'd saw the whole row of crosses for that particular category of knowledge. We also didn't say very much about it because there's going to be a whole session this afternoon on skill transfers, what training needs exist, how APTC might work better, what skills are transferred back to the countries, and so on and so forth. So I think there'll be a tremendous opportunity to discuss those things then. In terms of the Samoan participation, I think what we did say, and I think I hold very strongly to this, is we don't know as much as we'd like to know about the whole nature. What? Oh, sorry. the whole nature of migration of workers, because we're not talking to them in their own languages. Say we, I couldn't talk to Samoans in their own language. But we need that kind of in-depth study to really get at what kinds of things are happening to workers, how they experience these schemes, and how it relates to social change in all the PICs.
Anything else, John? That's all? Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. I think we can congratulate and thank the panelists in our usual manner. And thank you for all those diverse comments and questions. I know the rest of the day is also about labor mobility, so if we haven't answered anything, you can pick them up later. And I would not want to let go the Australia and New Zealand's contribution to the Pacific. I think it's been tremendous, and anywhere in the Pacific we go, you will see that what they've done is marvelous in terms of development and the like. So let me invite you to the morning tea, and I think we are just on time. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. That was good. Got off to a good start.
Jane, my fear and my struggle is that, you know, anything with government was sent to sometimes to the embassy. Was sent there because he was selling passports.
Yeah, when I need to meet you about we can do something together. The one you're talking about. Thank you.
Where are they?
County West during migration, because some of these coming to the country, I have seen this happening in our hospital. They're coming, seeing that they are doctors with these degrees and so on, but
training at all,
they're just
and established our pain farm in North Queensland, which is still being operated today. And when Ron did his PhD and we went to America for postdoctoral studies and came back, and I said,
what I'm saying is we can stop them